Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. We have today the one and only Dr. David Salomon, creative curriculum leader and esteemed scholar with a passion for unraveling the intricate tapestries of history and faith. Looking forward to our conversation today, David. Can you tell the people a little bit more about you?
Sure, absolutely. Oh, just excuse me 1 second. I got a cough. Okay. So I've been a professor of medieval literature, religion, and culture for 30 years. And currently I am at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia, where I am the director of research and creative activity. I also continue to teach in our honors program and our museum studies program. And I've written a bunch of books. My most recent book is on the 7 deadly sins. And we're in the midst here of a really cool conversation about mysticism.
Yeah, today we're digging in to Richard Rolle.
Yes, so Rolle fits into the scheme of what we've been talking about. He's another one of the 14th century English mystics. So he's living just a little bit before Marjorie Kemp, who we discussed last time, and right around the same time as Julian of Norwich, who we're going to talk about next week. So they all are, along with another Englishman named Walter Hilton, the four of them are kind of the epitome of 14th century English mysticism. And Rolle's story is really kind of interesting. I became really interested in him in graduate school. I'd never heard of him before. He is often referred to as Richard Rolle, Hermit of Hampole, because he did end up leading a hermit's life, which we can talk about, in Hampole in England. He lived from about 1290 to 1349 and is well known and prolific. He wrote many books, but one of the things that he is most well known for is he's one of the first religious writers to really write in the vernacular. He wrote in Middle English. He wrote a lot of work in Latin, but he did write some work in Middle English, which was the vernacular tongue at the time, so that normal everyday folks would be able to read it. The book that we're talking about today is not the case because it was written in Latin. It's called The Fire of Love, and the Latin title Incendium Amoris, and it was translated into Middle English, and was was a fairly popular book in its time. And it's an interesting text because it's a blend of a handbook written specifically for someone interested in leading a mystical life, but it also is very autobiographical and tells us a lot about Rolle himself. It is a real contrast with The Cloud of Unknowing, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, because The Cloud of Unknowing was all about knowing God and intellectually understanding God. Rolle is much more interested in the physical response, as was Marjorie Kemp. And probably the two senses that are most important in Rolle are hearing and feeling. So he talks about feeling that fire of love in his heart. And oftentimes throughout the book, he talks about hearing music, hearing melodious sounds. And that is oftentimes the way that he experiences the divine. His own story is really kind of interesting. He is Oxford educated, apparently spent time in Paris as well. Came back to England then and lived on the estate of a guy named John Dalton, and chose to lead the life of a hermit. Now, a hermit is someone who decides basically to separate from the world, most often for spiritual or religious reasons. It is not the same thing as someone who leads a cloistered life. So, sometimes people think hermits are people who live on their own and never see anybody. That's not necessarily the case. They do live on their own, but they oftentimes do see people, and Rolle did. In fact, he was the counselor for a congregation of nuns at a Cistercian monastery not too far from where he was residing. And it's to one of those nuns, it seems like he's writing this particular book. But in recent years, he has taken quite a beating in scholarship. And the real reason for that is something that we discussed when we were talking about Marjorie Kemp, is in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a tremendous, it's not really a resurgence, but a surgence in the study of female mystics and looking at a feminist approach to mysticism in the Middle Ages. And Rolle is pretty unabashedly, particularly in this work, a misogynist. And so, oftentimes people are turned off by that today and look at it. And I always, I acknowledge that when I teach Rolle. I mean, it's there. That's obviously who he was. But we also got to understand it's the 14th century. It's a different time and place. And so he tells us at one point, we can talk about it. It's one of the great passages in the book where he explains his own experience with women and basically what put him off women for the rest of his life. But the book itself, and I went through as I did with Marjorie Kemp just to pick out some things that I thought might be of interest. It's a curiosity. As I say, it was written in Latin. It was not written in Middle English. And yet in the prologue to it, he says that he writes the book not for philosophers or wise men, but he writes for the ignorant and untaught. But that doesn't scan, because the ignorant and untaught wouldn't have been able to read Latin. So it's a curious thing. We don't really know what's going on here and who his intended reader is.
Yeah, it's interesting to have that dichotomy there. Maybe it's an attempt to translation and interpretation. It's kind of a interesting.
Yeah, to be sure. And you mentioned dichotomy. I mean, this book is filled with dichotomies. It's filled with polarities, really. He is very clear about living in this world or living in the spiritual world, living the spiritual life or leading what we would now call a secular life. In fact, he says at one point in the opening chapter, love of God and love of this world can't reside together in the same soul. He really is sold on the idea that in order to truly be devoted to God, be devoted to the divine, you have to separate yourself from this world. And for him, that meant physically. And of course, this is following in a great tradition. The Desert Fathers are doing that early on in the church. But, what I think is really kind of different for him is that, as I say, the book is filled with all these sort of dichotomies, contradictions. I'm writing it for the ignorant and untaught, but I'm writing it in Latin, and, parentheses, they can't read Latin. He says, the mystery, he calls it, of the mystical life, he said, is hidden from most people. It's only really accessible to a few. And so is the point of the book to instruct us on how to lead this life? I don't know. Is it meant for folks who are leading a secular life, or is it written for folks who are already engaged in this kind of a religious existence? It seems more the latter than the former. But still, a lot of what he talks about is really kind of interesting. He mentions that again later on in the book when he says, I'm not saying that every man should do this. So, he's clear that this is not something that everybody's going to be able to accomplish, or that everybody even should try. There's a reason why some folks in our culture choose this kind of an existence, and they still do. They continue to do. And I'm not just talking about folks who enter monasteries and convents, but There was a story several years ago that I share with my students whenever we do Richard Rolle. I still have the cutting here from the New York Times, and it was a piece in the Times. I don't know what year this was because sadly I didn't put the year. But a gentleman in upstate New York was going to be consecrated as a hermit, and this was a ceremony that he was going to experience, which essentially was quite similar to the ceremony, the religious ceremony that nuns and monks go through, where they essentially die to this world. But he even mentions in this little article that was in the Times, he's a Benedictine monk. This guy was. He lives at his solitary hermitage. He says he spends 20% of his time as a staff member of the church, and he also works as a chaplain at an alcohol and drug abuse center. So they're not cloistered, right? But he also notes that he says few people are called to this vocation, noting that there are only a couple of dozen hermits in the United States. Most famous was Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, was a noted hermit. So it was really interesting because my students will often say, "Well, no one lives like that anymore." And then I whip this out and say, "Oh, yes, they do." Not many and not a lot, but there are people who do this. And by and large, I think that the way that they are regarded is really one of two ways. I mean, folks who are faithful and spiritual have tremendous respect for what people like this are doing. And folks who are non-believers find it an oddity and don't understand it. But this is all part and parcel of what Rolle's talking about throughout his text. I mean, he stresses, as I said, that everything's not intellectual. You have to experience life. But he's very, very strong on the virtue of humility. We have to be humble. He says, you're not going to experience this kind of life. You're not going to have this kind of mystical encounter with the divine if you aren't steeped in humility. And he repeats this over and over again in a variety of different ways. One of the other strongest things that he talks about throughout the book is the conflict between appearance and reality. The way the world, including people, seem to us and the way that it all really is. And in particular, because he's writing just on the cusp of the Reformation, he's taking on a lot of the so-called holy people who he sees as being corrupt. And he says, they only seem to be holy. Just be careful, right? And so that's why he chose, he said, not to pursue a life within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, because he just didn't see that as being the most productive way for him of reaching the divine.
It sounds like we're talking about his idea of anchorus.
It is a type of an anchorite experience, of an anchorus experience. Julian Norwich, who we'll talk about next week, is an anchorite. And so we can next week we can go over what the differences are between all these terms, because it is a little confusing, because anchorite is not a term that we hear very often anymore. And there are people who engage in that life as well still today. Fewer to be sure than once did, but it is not that unusual.
Yeah. Early in the discussion, we talked about maybe some of his ideas towards women.
Yeah.
And you had a story to share about that.
Yeah. So he tells us quite clearly in The Fire of Love about what happened to him. And if you'll indulge me, I'll read you the two paragraphs where he tells us his story. He says, there was a time when I was rebuked quite properly by 3 different women. One rebuked me because in my eagerness to restrain the feminine craze for dressy and suggestive clothes, I inspected too closely their extravagant ornamentation. So he and read what you will between the lines here. So he saw a woman who was dressed in a flashy kind of way, what he saw as flashy, and he, as he says, inspected too closely the ornamentation. Does that mean, I don't know what that means. You can take it as you want. He says, she said I ought not to notice them so as to know whether they were wearing horned headdresses or not. I think she was right to reprove me, he says. Another rebuked me because I spoke of her great bosom as if it pleased me. She said, what business is it of yours, whether it's big or little? She too was right. The third jokingly took me up when I appeared to be going to touch her somewhat rudely. I mean, so, clearly this is not appropriate for the Me Too generation, because he says, and perhaps had already done so. So he's not even sure if he had touched her rudely. He says, maybe I did. But she says to him, calm down, brother. It was as if she had said, it doesn't go with your office of hermit to be fooling with women. She too deservedly made me feel uncomfortable. Of course, people today would say it was really the reverse. I ought to have held off rather than to have behaved this way. So he does say, this was not good. When I came to myself, and I love that phrase, because he repeats it more than once in the book. When I came to myself, it's this sense of self-realization, of reflection and realizing what you've done. It says, when I came to myself, I thank God for teaching me what was right through their words, and for showing me a more pleasant way than my previous one, so that I might cooperate more fully with Christ's grace. I'm not going to put myself in the wrong with women henceforward. Then he says, a fourth woman, with whom I was in some way familiar, did not so much rebuke me as despise me when she said, you are no more than a beautiful face and a lovely voice. You have done nothing. I think it better, and this is his conclusion then, I think it better, therefore, to dispense with whatever their particular contribution to life is, rather than to fall into their hands which know no moderation, whether loving or despising. So, it's, and then he goes on to say, these things happen because I was seeking their salvation, not because I was after anything improper. Sounds like a little bit of an over justification and rationalization. So, I think it's interesting. I mean, it's somewhat humorous. I mean, given our situation today, it's not that funny anymore. You hear about these kinds of situations all the time, but his conclusion is that, I should just stay away from women entirely. He says, I know they've made some kind of particular contribution to life. It's not worth it. I'm staying away. And so that misogynistic approach to his existence, really permeates all of the work. And it just has an interesting, it serves as an interesting take on attitudes in the 14th century. I often show my students, there's this wonderful flow chart, which I wish I could share with you somehow. It's out of a fantastic book by James Brundage called Law, Sex, and Christian Society in Medieval Europe. It's basically a book about law in the Middle Ages. And he has this great flow chart where he talks about, he calls it the sexual decision-making process. And basically, it's a flow chart that almost everything ends with stop, it's a sin. And there are very few kind of, exceptions to this. And the exceptions are, do you want a child? And if you answer yes, then I'll tell you where you go. But if it's no, it's stop, it's a sin. Are you in church? Are you naked? Is it daylight? Is it Saturday? Is it Friday? Is it Wednesday? Is wife menstruating? Is wife pregnant? Is wife nursing a child? Is it Lent? Is it Advent? Is it Whitsun week? Is it Easter week? Is it a feast day? Is it a fast day? Is it a Sunday? And, if you answer to all of those questions, yes, then it's going to lead you finally to go ahead, but be careful. No fondling, no lewd kisses, no oral sex, no strange positions, only once. Try not to enjoy it. Good luck and wash afterwards. And in many ways, that's the attitude towards sex in the medieval church, right? And so, we've got to remember that this is a time period when we're still living in the shadow of the writings of folks like St. Augustine, who basically vilified Eve and said she's responsible for the downfall of man. And then along with her, that means all women. I don't know what that says about our wives, George. But they might want 10 minutes for a rebuttal.
Yeah.
Maybe more than 10.
I think it speaks to the ideas of intricate connection. And in Rolle's work, there's an intricate connection between the divine and human will. You know, how did he navigate that tension between personal agency and divine sovereignty?
Yeah, I mean, it's one that's a constant conflict, right? And I mean, it's been a constant conflict even throughout philosophy when we talk about the mind-body problem, right? I mean, for religious folks, there's always this issue, for mystics in particular, that we are spiritual beings trapped in a physical structure, right? And for many mystics, the goal is to have that spiritual side of you engage in the communion with the divine and experience ecstasy, right? Ecstasy, out of body, the Greek. But Rolle does acknowledge throughout his work that we are physical. I mean, he says, I experience this. I got heat in my chest. I feel the fire of love. I hear music. So, I mean, these are sensual experiences that he's having. And to be sure, Marjorie Kemp, who we talked about last time, is experiencing a lot of the same kinds of things, physical pain and physical joy as well. And so I think that this has always been a problem, and it continues to be a problem for a lot of people today, whether we're talking about a spiritual sense of yourself or the intellectual sense. Right. I mean, in the religious life and the monastic life, it's a way of getting away from the physical world to somehow be closer to God by removing yourself from everyday life. And for a lot of academics, myself included, I mean, that's what the university life is meant to emulate. It's the same kind of existence. It's just you are not completely divorced from the secular world. You're still attempting to live in it. But I mean, as you mentioned, I think that there's always that pull of physical will and physical need and physical desire. It's what we talk about in the 7 deadly sins with lust, right? And the fact that intellectually we know those are bad things. But because we are created the way that we are, it's difficult for us to navigate that and to find some kind of a balance, right? And more difficult for some people than others, right? Which is, the source of so many of our problems, isn't it?
Yeah. Often you hear him talk about self-emptying to attain divine union. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's that scale, that journey that Evelyn Underhill talked about, right? That journey through illumination, purgation, and then union. So it's definitely, I mean, and all of the mystics talk about this as being progressive. It isn't something which is just going to boom happen. Walter Hilton, who I mentioned earlier, I mean, his great work is called The Ladder of Perfection. He's talking about moving up the ladder, right, to reach that goal. And so there's so much of what's involved in these works is about process and about how you get there. And again, as we've talked about, it isn't necessarily focused on the goal, because that's not what's important. And as Rolle says, I mean, this isn't going to be for everybody, right? People are going to engage in this and who aren't going to have that ultimate kind of experience. I mean, I know, lots of monks, lots of guys who are in the monastery, and, some of them are experiencing a spiritual kind of life on a different level than others. It isn't the same for everybody. And Rolle is really clear to tell you that. So I think his fear is that you're going to pick up the book and say, okay, I'll read this book and I'll, have my divine union. And he's saying it doesn't work that way.
In the context of his era, revolutionary or heretical, you think?
So that's an interesting question because while he was alive, I don't know if revolutionary is the right word, but certainly not heretical. Once he died and the Reformation hits, he is considered heretical by many. There was a movement afoot after he died to have him sainted. In fact, the nuns at the monastery drew up the initial documents, and we have them, to present to the church to have him go through the first step to sainthood. It never happened. The Reformation hit, and all sorts of things occurred in England, of course, the English Reformation. He was still recognized in the Anglican Church. I think he still is today on the Anglican calendar. But I know that there's an image of Rolle that's in a manuscript. It was one of the only ones that we had for many years. In fact, it may be at the frontispiece of this book that I've got here. No, it's not. And it's from a manuscript, and it was an illustration of him. And someone had scratched out the face, what we do in yearbooks when we don't want to remember somebody, right? And this is the way, at the time, this was a way of trying to literally get rid of memory of somebody, right? And so somebody had scratched out the face so that we wouldn't see him, because he was considered somewhat heretical. I had mentioned several weeks ago this volume, which I pulled off the shelf here. This is the Richard Rolle of Hampole, 2 volumes that I had wanted to have when I was in graduate school, had searched high and low for. I'd only seen library copies of it before. And then I found this copy on the shelf in a used bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I bought it. It cost me $60. Yeah. So, it was a big expense for me, especially in graduate school. But this came out 1895. Wow. There are actually 2 volumes. But the really neat thing about the volume that I ended up buying, as I mentioned before, is it's the volume that was owned by Geraldine Hodgson, who became a scholar of Rolle. And she owned it. She dated it November 24th, 1917.
Wow.
And it's got all sorts of things pasted into it, and notes, which it's just really, really a cool thing to have. It's one of my favorite possessions is this volume. And it's got the we talked about smell at one point. It's got the smell of the old book, which is now 130 years old. But he was popular. He was popular, and he became more popular in the early 20th century when folks like Evelyn Underhill, and especially Hope Emily Allen came along, and she edited his work and reprinted it for the first time in a long time, in a really nice little volume. And there was a resurgence of interest in him. A lot of work was attributed to him, which eventually we realized he didn't write. One of the most famous works in the Middle Ages is a very, very long piece called The Prick of Conscience. It's very long. It's very dry. It's very laborious. And for a long time, it was attributed to him. In fact, in this volume, it is included as one of the things that's in the book, because they thought it was his. And later on, we realized he didn't write it. Actually, we don't know who wrote it, but it wasn't him. So there's still a lot of interesting work going on in this discipline.
Yeah. What parallels do you think can be drawn between Richard Rolle's mysticism and the broader medieval mystic tradition in Europe and beyond?
I think if there's one thing to point to, I would think it would be that the mystics tend to want you to make sure that if you're going to follow their example, if you're going to enter this kind of an existence, you need to be doing it because you want to go to God and not that you're trying to run away from the world. And that continues to be a concern today within the monastic world. When folks come in and take their initial vows in monasteries and convents, one of the things that is really reviewed is why you're doing this. We want to make sure that you're not running away from something, but that you're actually running to God. And I told you the story about my friend at the monastery, and we had the guy there who had been a Nazi. He was running from the world, but it was also determined that he was also running to God because he felt this need to atone and repent. And so, he was an interesting case. But I mean, that was a concern throughout the Middle Ages, and it's still a concern today for folks who lead this kind of life is the motivation. Why are you doing it? Right. And if you're, I think a lot of people, especially today, right, we hear a lot today about people who just want to get away from the world. Right. I've had enough of the world. I want to get away from the world. And so they try to do that in a variety of different ways. Right. Maybe they'll move somewhere really remote. Maybe they'll just start to hunker down in their own houses and become hoarders. We lots of different flavors of this. And it's one thing to do that, but it's another thing to want to leave this world as the Desert Fathers did, because they felt that the din of this world was getting in the way of their spiritual longing and their spiritual desire. And Rolle talks about that, and it's interesting because the experiences that he has where he says he hears music, he doubts it. He says, I don't know what's going on. I'm confused by this. As Marjorie Kemp did the same thing. She didn't want to tell anybody. Right. And there's one passage in the book where he actually went to somebody else and said, essentially, do you hear this too? And a person said, no, I don't hear anything. And Rolle realized that this was an experience that he alone was having. And that although he could hear it, he said, with his physical ear, somehow it was happening internally in his spirit. But he swore that he heard the music.
It's like the voice of your grandmother that you heard.
Yeah. It's and it really feeds into his whole concern with appearance and reality, right? Is this really happening? Or is my mind playing a trick on me? Because with this kind of experience, oftentimes, because it's not objective, there's often no way to really answer that question. You have to go with your gut feeling. And if you are someone who is a person of faith and a believer, you're probably gonna swing one way. If you're a person who is not and who tries to rationally explain everything, you're going to swing the other way.
It brings up this idea of the divine spark within the soul, whether it's a voice, whether it's something you see, whether it's something you act.
Yeah.
How did he interpret this concept?
It tends to be different for all of these writers. So they all experience this in a different way. I mean, Julian, who we'll talk about next week, I mean, in one scene in her book, I mean, Jesus comes down and sits on her bed, has a conversation with her. I mean, Rolle never has that. He hears music.
Right.
He feels heat. Marjorie Kemp, it was more about this overwhelming, almost like a shadow over her soul, which made her weep and made her ill because she couldn't handle it. It was so overpowering. And so, I really do think it tends to be different with a lot of the writers. The fact that in this book, Rolle calls it the fire of love, the incendium amoris, of course, and we've got that emblematic image throughout so much of Christian literature of the heart on fire with God's love, right? And that's really what Rolle is going after here, and that's what he claims to have had.
It's so beautiful to me, the way in which the Spirit the divine spark, creativity, all these things can reach into us and help us create outside of us.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of what makes us human, right?
Yeah.
Is our ability to be creative when it comes to things like that. It is. I mean, some would claim uniquely human, the ability to create, and some would argue that it is the divine that's being channeled through you when you create. And some people will argue with that, that you're the divine or a muse or something spiritual, right? Something spiritual that is kind of speaking through you, using you as an amanuensis, as we talked about, right?
Yeah. He spoke quite a bit about nature and creativity too, as well. Is that well?
Yeah, well, I mean, and part of that is because he's living out in the woods, and so the creative impulse, I think, is really something which is much more accessible when you are away from the din of humanity. Now, that said, I know plenty of writers and artists who live in big cities and say that they get all their energy and that's where they do their best work. But I also know a lot of artists and writers and musicians who only can work when they go away. And oftentimes we hear, especially when it comes to musicians and authors, right, that they really do their best work when they leave, right? I was watching, when you watch Bohemian Rhapsody and hear about Queen, right, and the fact that they had to go and leave and be in just some house somewhere, and that's where they did their best work and composed that album. And I've got certainly lots of author friends who do that as well. I mean, when I was in graduate school, and I think I've told you the story, George, so stop me if I'm being repetitive. I had just met my friend who's at the monastery. I'd probably known him at that point for about 3 years. And I remember I called him and I said I was just completely stuck. I was working on my dissertation and the spark had gone away and I was stuck. I didn't know what to do. And I was ready to just toss the whole thing. And he said, why don't you come up to the monastery and spend a couple of days in the Hermitage? Okay. So on the grounds of the monastery, and it's a huge monastery, huge grounds. I don't know how many acres. I'm just looking it up now. Are on the Spencer Monastery, but it is 2,300 acres. It's huge. But of course, only part of that is buildings. There's a lot of farmland, a lot of woodland, and I'll never forget. I pulled up to the front of the main building, and he was waiting for me. And he got in my car, and he said, "All right, drive." And so we drove down this long, thin road out into the woods on the property. And he's telling me, turn left here, turn right there. And all of a sudden he said, stop. Okay. And he had told me, he said, bring your books, bring your stuff, bring some clothes for the weekend, that kind of thing. And we got out of the car and we walked through the woods, probably about 100 yards, partially across this little stream. I remember there was a wooden piece of timber there that we walked across using it as a bridge. And out in the middle of nowhere there was a little hermitage, a little one-room little house out in the middle of the woods. And we went into it. No heat, no running water. Basically, it was a bed and a desk. And he said, all right. He said, I'll see you in a couple days. And he left me there to work and, as it is a hermitage, to reflect and think and contemplate. And so, it was a taste of leaving the world. I mean, this is before cell phones, so it wouldn't have mattered, but I'm sure there's no cell service out there. There's no electricity. So, and I got to tell you, I mean, I stayed out there, I think for 2 or 3 nights. I can't remember if it was 2 or 3. But I do remember after the second day, you start to get a little loopy, because you are living away from everything. Now, I'm a Jew from the Bronx. We don't camp. We don't. I mean, we tried it thousands of years ago in the desert. It sucked. We're not doing it again. And so, this was something which was not familiar to me, and it was an interesting experience. And it was in many ways a kind of a little taste of what that life is like. It's very different from what we experience day to day out, quote unquote, in the world. And it shows you how incredibly difficult it is to live in this world and engage in that kind of intellectual, spiritual, creative activity, because there's just so much noise. And being out in the Hermitage for a couple of days, there's no noise out there. I mean, it is dead quiet. And so, as a result, it made me think of when I lived in South Dakota. I knew a Lakota medicine man who invited me to come and do the sweat lodge. I did the sweat lodge twice out there on the res. And it's a similar kind of thing. It has a physical and a psychological effect on you. That solitude and that physical, I don't know what the right word is. Physical, it's strenuous, and it sounds silly to say it's strenuous to just be by yourself in a one little room for a couple of days, but it was, especially for somebody like me who's such an extrovert. Nobody to talk to. You don't see anybody. And the sweat lodge was a similar kind of experience. That one, very effective. Have you ever done a sweat lodge, George?
No, but I spent some time in isolation tanks.
Oh, did that 2 years ago. Yeah. It's somewhat similar. Although the extreme heat,
right,
and the way that your body really does purge itself of all of its impurities, because you're just sweating like you can't believe, it has a particular kind of effect on you. So it's a kind of an interaction of the physical and the intellectual. Whereas the isolation tank, for me at least, it was more of an intellectual experience than a physical one. It was psychological. And I know that the couple of inches of the salty water is supposed to make all the difference in those tanks. I didn't think that it made any difference to me, but I don't know, maybe it had that different experience for you.
I've spent some time when I was younger as a wrestler, and not that it's a sweat lodge, but depriving myself of food, going into saunas, and there's a certain sort of clarity, the cleansing of the doors of perception, maybe, that comes with diet and sweating and heightened states of awareness.
Yeah. No, I mean, and that's what all the ascetic practices of the religious life are all about, right? Just denying the body, and in that case, to edify the soul, so that you can have a more pure experience. But I mean, people talk about that all the time. I mean, I know when I've done, I'm a carbohydrate addict. I would have made a terrible wrestler, because I cannot not eat carbs, and carbs are the worst thing for a wrestler. And so, there have been times when I've gone on these carb diets where I cut out carbs completely. Well, for the first 2 weeks, you're the biggest SOB going, because you're going through withdrawal. But after that, you do feel a different sense of clarity, just mental clarity, and a clearer state of mind. It's just, as is the case with the spiritual life, it's difficult to maintain that. And eventually, you eat a bowl of pasta and you're screwed, which is what happens to me usually.
Yeah. There's a really good author, Young Chul Han, and he speaks, he's got a bunch of cool books that speak to this idea of the like the pornographic nature of the uninterrupted message. Like it's just, and that's what seems to happen in the cities or the worlds we live in. It's just constant bombardment.
It is. I mean, there's a guy who years ago referred to it as data smog.
Yeah.
Right. And it's just a great way to think about it. David Shanks was his name. He wrote a book called Data Smog back in it must have been the 90s. And this idea that we are, it reminds me of the robot in Short Circuit, right? Who was always saying input, more input. That's where we're constantly processing. And we're seeing slowly through psychological studies that that's not a good way to operate. It just doesn't. I taught my first class of the semester last night, and we were talking about the fact that the course has a lot of reading, and that is going to require that you take time and sit and actually reading a book. And most people these days are just that's an activity that's foreign to them. They don't read sustainably. They read as long as it takes to read something on a phone usually. And here I'm asking them to read 40 chapters in the Bible for one night, and it's just how are they going to do that? And so it'll be interesting to see how they handle it. Every year it's interesting to see how they approach it.
I've been doing some research on the evolution of language, and it seems to me that we have really transformed our world, and you can see it in the use of organic metaphors that we used to use and that of the mechanistic metaphors that we use now.
Yeah,
they really chart it.
Yeah, I mean, as we've moved from what I refer to as an analog world to a digital world, right?
Yeah,
and there's a good deal to be lost as a result of that. I was talking earlier with a friend of mine who's a librarian, and we were talking about the days when you would use all books in the reference room in the library. Well, I mean, those are all gone now because everything's online. I mean, a lot of libraries don't even have a reference room anymore. The books aren't up to date, whereas the things they can get online are more up to date. And so they just don't use them anymore. And it was funny because we were on the phone and I was looking up something actually for our talk today. And I wanted to read the entry in the Dictionary of National Biography on Richard Rolle. And so I went on to I was talking to my friend and I went on to our library catalog, assuming that we must have had an electronic subscription to the Dictionary of National Biography. It's a fairly standard reference work. And we don't. We actually still have the paper copy. It's old, but we have the paper copy somewhere in the library. And it was so funny because I was talking to my friend and I said, how is it that we possibly don't have this online? And she said, you're probably the only person who even knows about that thing, because people don't use those kinds of reference books anymore. Everything is through Google. And so, it's also just part and parcel of the instant gratification that we have, right? The society that we have that demands that. We were talking about the fact that if you're sitting around talking about some movie and you're thinking about an actor, but you can't remember their name, just whip out the phone and you'll have it in 2 seconds, and oftentimes I'll be sitting with friends and we'll be doing that. And I'll say, all right, wait a minute. Let's not just immediately look it up on our phones. Let's see if we can, let it percolate for a minute. It's in there. You just can't remember it right now. See if you can, and it's a memory exercise. And we don't really do that anymore.
Yeah, when you don't use a muscle, it atrophies.
Yeah, absolutely. And memory is one of the things that, is really we're losing it. And, on the one level, it's okay because, as we've talked about before, the idea of the internet being kind of an extension of our memory. But the problem with it for me is, as I've often said, we're not doing anything with what it's freeing up. It's freeing up our minds for what we hoped was going to be higher level thinking, and most people aren't engaging in that. I like to believe you are on this podcast, though. That's why I'm happy you're here.
Yeah, vice versa. There's this interesting idea that I see popping up from time to time. This idea of rewilding, and you can see it in nature. And sometimes I think we're beginning to see it in spirituality. When I read your book, The Seven Deadly Sins, or we have these conversations about mystics, from time to time, I will hear people that I talk to have this spark of creation. And it seems to me it's a lot like that spark of divinity. And I feel like maybe sometimes you have to lose everything in order to rewild. Maybe, and I'm hopeful that's what we're going to see in this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to put it. And I think what happens is for a lot of people, that spark is trying to fight its way through.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And part of what folks like Richard Rolle were talking about in the 14th century was readying yourself for that experience. And unfortunately for a lot of people today, they don't ready themselves for the experience, and then when it comes, they either squelch it or dismiss it. Right? They don't take advantage of it. So I mean, it sounds cliche, but I've always got a pad next to me, especially when I sleep, because you wake up with these ideas and you want to write them down. You don't want to forget them. And oftentimes they're those little sparks of things that come to you. They really are. I was writing something the other day, and I was driving in the car and thinking about the piece because I was a little stuck with it and I don't like where it's at. And I was thinking about a different approach to talking about what I was trying to say. And I came up with these 3 words that work perfectly. And so, here I am in the car, and, you certainly don't want to write anything down, but I didn't want to lose it because it did come as a kind of a spark. And so, as soon as I was driving to the office, as soon as I got here, I wrote it down because I didn't want to forget it.
I love to hear those stories. For me, it's usually in the bathroom at like 3 a.m.
Yeah. Well, most people, and I tell this to my students, I mean, most people, the only time that we get to spend really alone is when you're in the shower.
Yeah.
Unless you're lucky enough to be in there with somebody else. That's the only time that we spend by ourselves. So oftentimes people will say, I got this idea in the shower. It's like, well, yeah, because you were by yourself. There was nothing else to do. And so the thought came to you. And maybe we need to take more showers as a culture. I don't know.
I don't know if it's magic or tragic that's the only time we're alone.
I think it's tragic, to be honest. And by alone, that we have to go to that extreme to be alone, right? To get naked and be in the shower by yourself is the only way that you can be alone. And I mean, we hear people talk about this. Mothers have liked to talk about this for years, right? When you have a newborn, it's like the only time I get for myself is when I'm in the bathroom. It's sad that that's what it's come to. Is that, and I think a lot of it goes back to what you were talking about with just this incredible noise and the data smog that we have. It's really hard. I mean, you can't go anywhere these days and sit and wait for something without seeing people just down the line on their phones. Nobody's able to just sit. You go to a doctor's office and go and look in the waiting room, right? People are sitting there, they're on their phones. I'm here at a university, right? The students are on their phones, it seems 24/7. It's just an extension of their physical beings now. And it's really I don't know, it strikes me as sad. I mean, I used to walk around on college campus when I was in college, and the most I had was I remember when the Sony Walkman came out, and that was like revolutionary. You're gonna be able to walk around and listen to music, right? We didn't even have that before then. And so, the idea now that you can't even just go walk across campus and be quote unquote alone with your thoughts, people are on their phones, either looking at stuff or talking to somebody, and it's an interesting thing.
It is. Elaine says here, I love the idea of rewilding myself. Maybe this is why I find going down the veg path and getting my hands in the earth is so healing.
Yeah.
Getting away from technology is very healing and quieting for the soul.
Yeah, that's really, and I think that's why a lot of people really do love things like gardening, right? Is literally getting back to the earth.
Yeah.
Right. And really, understanding that. They say that the only way that you really understand anything about what you eat is if you grow your own food and understand where it comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we're constantly told that when you sit down to eat something, you should think about, right, where it came from, how it got to your table, and to trace it back.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I like what Elaine is saying there. And I wonder if that Elaine Mason is the same Elaine Mason that I know, but I don't know. She'll text me and let me know. But the idea that you can grow your own food is so satisfying for a lot of people, to be able to eat something that came out of your own garden.
Mm-hmm.
And I do like that, again, that idea of rewilding myself. It's kind of getting us back to a place where we were. What's that line from the Crosby, Stills, Nash song, for the Joni Mitchell Woodstock? Got to get back to the garden, right? She's talking about the Garden of Eden, but nevertheless, getting back to the garden.
I think there's a strange parallel here. The fact that to be naked and alone in your bathroom with your thoughts, you have to probably go through 4 locked doors. Your front door, your hallway door, your bedroom door, your bathroom door, and then the sliding shower door.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does that say about us? Like, you have to be that secure in order to be alone.
Well, because there is some vulnerability there, right?
Yeah.
Being alone makes you vulnerable. That's why we've always said there's safety in numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is a vulnerability, which also is one of the reasons people shun away from it, because it's scary. It's frightening to be alone with your thoughts for some people.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate that. I can understand that. I've been through that myself. Periods of time when I experienced, extreme anxiety, and the last thing I want to do is be alone with myself, but with my own thoughts. But it's a leap of faith, I think, that's required to do that, to make yourself vulnerable. It's the trust exercises a bit.
Yeah.
Right. To trust other people and to know. I sit here in the office sometimes, and if I want to be alone, as you say, I've got to close the door. It's not necessarily because I need it to be quieter. It's not much quieter when I close the door. There's not a lot of noise here. My office is in the library, and but it's more about the vulnerability of being alone here, and somebody may walk in, and somebody may interrupt me, and you don't want that. So there are times when I'll say to my administrative assistant, I just need to close the door for a little bit, and I'll just sit down in the chair and just sit there, just to sit for a little while, and it's a form of meditation, I guess. But
sure,
it's a way of being alone with my thoughts, which again does make you vulnerable.
And think about it from the point of view of an instance like Richard Rolle had. If so many of us are afraid to be alone with our thoughts, what does it feel like to be alone with the strange music?
Yeah. It has to be terrifying. It has to be terrifying. And a lot of the mystics do feel that. that sense when they have these experiences. I mean, the first thing they do is doubt its veracity,
Right.
and think maybe it's the devil trying to tease me and to tempt me. Oh, it is her, and she has an excess of zucchini.
Yeah.
Hi, Elaine. Elena's in Wales. Elena is one of our oldest friends in Swansea, Wales. So Borda, Elaine. It's and I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. What were we talking
That's
about?
okay. The frightening feeling
Yes,
of the
yes.
music.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary, because as human beings, we try to explain it away, and our first impulse is to think, I'm crazy, I'm going crazy. And so, to be comfortable with the idea that that's not what it is. But all of the mystics experienced that. Marjorie Kemp did. That's why she didn't want to tell anybody about what happened. Rolle is kind of sensitive about sharing what he's gone through, because it's very personal, and he doesn't think anybody's going to understand it, because he can't really explain what it's like.
Right.
That's the other part of it. And we talked about that with the cloud of unknowing, right? The ineffable nature of all of this. Right. You have this kind of divine experience. And I mean, how do you put that into human words? Right. It's why we have so few accounts of this, these experiences. And again, if you read Richard Rolle or go to Thomas Merton and, 7 Story Mountain, read him, or read the works of the Buddhist monks, who talk about their experiences, is always a struggle to put this into human language.
I always fall back on Iliad and think about the terror before the sacred.
Yeah.
That's just a great way to describe that experience. Like, it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
What do I do with this?
Yeah. Well, it's, as we said before, it's awful, right? You're full of awe.
That. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Well, Dave, we're coming up on our hour right here. This is so much fun. I love it. I have to put $1 in my jar now because I just said that. Dang it. My daughter's going to crush me. Okay. Such a great time. I'm so thankful. Perhaps you could tell people a little bit where they can find you, what you have coming up, and what you're excited about.
Sure. So my website is David A. Salomon, SALOMON.com. Links to all of my books and the blog, which I'm getting back to writing again, and appearances and my consulting. Excited. We are beginning a new academic year on campus. Classes began on Monday. And so the students are back, which is always a different kind of energy, which I certainly appreciate. And excited about the year ahead, and as well as my own teaching. I'm teaching an honors class this semester that I'm also looking forward to. So.
Well, that's what we got for today, ladies and gentlemen. We will be back soon, I'm sure. Thanks for everybody for hanging out. And if you hear a strange echo, try to think of it as a divine voice.
Exactly.
Aloha, everyone.